Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
I'd like to call this informational meeting of Tuesday, June 7th, 2022 to order. And as we always do, council remarks. Any council members? Well, then this would be my time I'd like to publicly apologize to the mayor. Last Thursday night at the firefighters cadet graduation, I spilled my drink on him. So if you see him giving me the stink eye tonight in the meeting, that's probably why. We'll move right into our presentations then. Experience Sioux Falls bid ordinance. Sean Pritchard, please.
Sean Pritchard, Director of Finance, also the liaison to the bid board, and have been working through this ordinance revision here over actually the last 16 to 18 months. I will say we haven't had this large of an audience here for a presentation of mine in a long time, so pretty excited about that here. So we're just going to jump right in. This is something that's going to be coming to the council here, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, and as an ordinance for 2 readings. So I kind of wanted to walk you through it as part of the information a little bit more in detail. And then when we get to presenting it at the council meeting, we can be a little bit more brief at that time as well. So just to give you a little bit of background, what is the Sioux Falls Convention and Visitors Bureau Business Improvement District? So in way of background, it was begun in January 1st, 2011. It includes any hotel within the city boundaries of the city of Sioux Falls with 40 or more rooms. It's an occupational tax, so we charge $2 per room, per occupied room, per evening. And unlike the lodging tax, which flows through to the state and then to the city, and then we transfer it to the Experience Sioux Falls, this is one we actually collect, and so the hotels report to the city, they report how many rooms that they had occupied for that month, and then they remit the $2 per room payment to the city, and then we go forth and remit that directly to Experience Sioux Falls for the purposes set out in ordinance, which is essentially for the promotion and marketing in the community. It is generating about $2 million per year on average. There is a bid board that is appointed by the mayor and approved by the city council consent that oversees the bid entirely, as well as reviews the budget and proposes the budget annually. That is presented to you in early September each year, as it will be this year as well. Why are we looking to update the bid ordinance? Well, there was a number of, I would say, things that needed to be updated within the bid ordinance. Even a couple, there was a internal audit that was done of the bid, I think about 18 or 24 months ago, and they identified some of the challenges that we had as well. There's just some cleanup work. We actually originally listed all of the hotels subject to the bid in the ordinance. That is constantly out of date just because you have new hotels that come online subject to it, and those that leave or close. The ordinance itself already states that anybody of a certain room size is automatically in the bid. There's no need to include that listing of hotels in there. We are also updating it. Experience Sioux Falls had went through some strategic planning about 3-4 years ago, and at that time decided to rebrand themselves as Experience Sioux Falls instead of the Chamber and Visitors Bureau, or excuse me, the Convention and Visitors Bureau. And so they had changed their name, but the ordinance wasn't updated to reflect that. In addition, they're going through a transition period of becoming a distinct legal entity, and so the ordinance needs to reflect that as well. We currently do not allow for electronic payments of those bid tax remittances, so we're trying to get into the 20th century and updating the ordinance to allow that to occur. We're also changing a little bit on the bid board membership, so it's not changing the what comprises the bid, but one of the things that you will see is there's been some consolidation in the industry, and we have some provisions on not having a general manager or an owner of a hotel have more than one representative on the bid board, and with that it's becoming increasingly challenging to find people to be able to serve on the bid board and fill those seats, which I'll talk about here in a bit. And so we're going to make a few changes there. And then we also set more realistic penalties. The late fees that were established in the original ordinance, I think you will find to be egregious and frankly unenforceable to a certain extent, at least some of them. So we're modifying them to be more reasonable as we're looking how we mechanically take care of the bid as the city. So as stated here, some of the changes that are going to be included in the bid ordinance revision. We do modify the name from the Sioux Falls Convention and Visitors Bureau bid to be going forward Experience Sioux Falls bid, and then we substitute the name throughout the ordinance accordingly. It recognizes Experience Sioux Falls as a separate and distinct corporate entity, It removes the list of hotels from the ordinance, and it also allows for that electronic transmission that I referred to. In terms of who comprises the bid board, so the bid board, as stipulated in ordinance, includes 3 members who represent hotels with over 100 rooms, 2 members that represent hotels with 75 to 99 rooms, a member who represents the smaller hotels with less than 75 rooms. There are 2 members from the Experience Sioux Falls Executive Committee, and then 1 public member appointed at large. They can either be an owner or they can be a general manager for those hotels, but again, as I mentioned before, we were limited to only 1. Which created a lot of challenges and really trying to get the best people that we wanted to have be on this board, as well as to make sure we were filling vacant seats. So the revised ordinance would allow up to 2, and it's an 11-member board, so they still wouldn't have a significant interest or overwhelming interest on it, but it would allow opportunities for more people to participate. It also clarifies that board members can serve 2 consecutive full terms. Previously, we were filling a lot of interim positions for 1 or 2 years, and then they could only serve 2 terms, and so then they would have another 3 years, and then they'd be off. So this would allow for a little bit more continuity of the board as well. It eliminates the requirement for the board member to be a registered voter or resident of the city of Sioux Falls, but they have to have a representative ownership interest in a hotel subject to the bid. So as we grow as a community, you might have owners and so forth that live in surrounding towns or a general manager, but they would be a great contributor to our board. This eliminates that requirement from the board positions. It allows the board to declare a seat vacant if a member misses more than 2 meetings. I think they're required to meet quarterly. It adds an ex officio position for the immediate past chair if they happen to be term limited, again, to allow some continuity of leadership as they transition between chairs. And then the late penalty is adjusted. So we have a 10% one-time late fee that is assessed when you are late with your payments to the city of Sioux Falls. And then after that, what the old ordinance was is you had $200 per day that you were to pay as an additional assessment. And we really hadn't been assessing that because it was kind of beyond what was probably reasonable for most of these hotels. And of course, we went through COVID. So instead, we're changing that to a $200 charged fee per month, not per day, and it only applies to payments more than 2 months past due. And to be frank, while we do have a few late payments, it hasn't been real bad. And considering that we had went through COVID, it's actually improved since COVID. We work very closely with the staff at Experience Sioux Falls, and they do a lot of follow-up to hotels that have run behind, so that kind of pulls some of that administrative burden off the city for that as well. As far as the timeline, the bid board actually approved this back in 2021. We had the informational presentation today, and then the 2 readings will be on June 21st and July 5th for second reading. We did send a letter about 2 weeks ago to all the hotels subject to the bid, letting them know that the bid was going to be changed and what the changes were going to be, and just giving them an opportunity to come and speak at those 2 council meetings if they so choose. We have not received any comments back at this time from any of those that have received that. As I noted, Experience Sioux Falls is in a period of transition right now. They were previously and currently still operate as a division of the Greater Sioux Falls Chamber of Commerce. As part of that transition, the ES corporate board has been formed. They have established bylaws. We're working through that transition plan. And then in October of 2022, that is the anticipated date for independent operations. And I say anticipated because there's a lot of mechanics that go along with changing all of this order, including agreements. And the city is involved to the extent that we're kind of the conduit that allows all of this money to flow through. So we have to time the ordinance and any new agreements with the organizations accordingly. So some of the next steps that we will have is, the first is this bid ordinance revision. We will have to look at revising the lodging tax and visitor center use agreement. So the agreement that transfers the lodging tax over to the CVB or Experience Sioux Falls, as well as their use of our visitor center in Falls Park. Those agreements previously with the chamber and the CVB expire on October 31st, or excuse me, October 1st. And so they will have to be redone directly with Experience Sioux Falls. We will also have to work through how the potential transfer of assets will occur. That might have to occur through the city of Sioux Falls. So any remaining cash balances, personal property by agreement potentially may have to come back to the city of Sioux Falls. So we may have to supplement an additional supplement for this year in order to transfer those funds over then to Experience Sioux Falls. But we are continuing to meet with the chamber and Experience Sioux Falls as we work through those mechanics. So we'll have some more details of that here in the upcoming weeks as we start to bring some of those agreements forward for your consideration. Lastly, I just thought I would give kind of a status of where the industry is for hospitality, and there's a lot of positive things happening, and hopefully we continue to see that momentum carry us throughout the city, throughout the summer. The first one is occupancy, to kind of give you an idea of where things are at. We look at occupancy because that is what will drive the bid tax revenues, because it's a fixed charge on every occupied room. And so you can see kind of in that chart, we just compared January through May for the last 3 years, and obviously the gray line there is the COVID year, and you can see what happened in that mid-March, early March timeframe as COVID started to take hold. And they really started to come out of it about this April time period in 2021, so you see it really coming back up. 2022 has been even better in their first couple of months, and now you're going to see it really kind of returning to what is normalcy there. Overall occupancy is up 12% year to date, 2022 versus 2021. Our bid revenues are up 20%, and some of the strengths you're going to see in the industry happening right now is leisure travel is still obviously very good. Hopefully that will continue with energy prices where they are currently at. Group tours have been very good as well, and of course athletic tournaments really bring a lot of people and fill rooms within our various hotels here in the community. As far as revenues overall, we look at revenues because lodging taxes are going to be driven on the revenue side versus the occupancy, so it's going to be a balance between what you're charging and what the occupied room rate is. And here, I think the news is even more positive. Where occupancies were coming back, the revenue per average room rate really started to come back. And again, you see that COVID year in green as we come out of it there, and then the blue line being 2022. Your average room rates are up 32% year to date. Total revenues are up $12 million year to date. Lodging tax revenue is up 42% through April of this year. As far as challenges being experienced by the industry, they're not unlike many of the other industries, particularly those in the hospitality areas. Labor and material shortages continue to have a lot of challenges for them, as well as utility costs for those various hotel operators. With that, I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. There's several guests in the audience that can be available to you for any questions, including Terry, who is the head of the CEO for Experience Sioux Falls. We also have the head of the Chamber of Commerce, Jeff Griffin, and a number of the board members and advisory board members for Experience Sioux Falls. So with that, happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Councilors, questions? Neitzer.
This is a little off. Well, maybe it's on topic. What does a pipeline look like for construction of hotels that would expand the space? I mean, isn't there one like at Dolly Farm and Lake Lorraine? Are they starting to get confidence again to start building more or not?
Hi, Terry Schmidt with Experience Sioux Falls. Yeah, I think there's a gaining confidence in the hotels being built. I've had 3 calls from the hunters, I guess you would say, or the bankers who are representing different hotel groups, inquiring about Sioux Falls, and we know that there's one going up by Sanford, of course, and the Sioux Steel project, and potentially a couple of others. But I think from everything that we're learning and seeing, there is more confidence gaining. Conventions and meetings have been slow to come back, and they drive a lot of that type of building. But I just read an article before I came over here that said the forecast for conventions and meetings is to really rebound now in this next year. So I would imagine that will drive more interest. So
Related to that, where is business travel and what is the outlook on that?
Kind of the same. I think you're talking corporate travel. Corporate travel is picking up. I think we're seeing more of it. It took a hard hit, as you know, but again, I think people who are in the corporate world are finding, at least from what we're learning, that meetings face-to-face are much more productive than continuing to Zoom everything, or send an email. So there is some of that coming back as well, and we would anticipate even more. Of course, with higher airline prices, higher gas prices, it may take a little bit longer.
Other questions? Councilor Starr.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Terry, but I want
Director Pritchett, if I can. I think most of the people in the room that came today were here for our medical cannabis discussion rather than you, but take credit for it if you want.
Just wait. They're all going to stand up and leave when I'm done.
There were two things that really kind of stood out to me. One, I think it's a real shift in policy position to allow non-citizen members on advisory boards as well as not being a registered voter. I don't think there's another advisory group out of the 60, some of them, that allow that, is there?
I can't answer that for every advisory board. For example, like the new event center board that was recreated by the council, we don't necessarily have a residency requirement. I think some have and some haven't. The challenge, I think we still have it for the at-large citizen member on the board, which makes sense because you don't want that person to be local and within the community. But the challenge that you have is that, you know, because if that person owns a hotel in our city, do they have any less of a vested interest if they don't happen to live in Sioux Falls? And that's the challenge that we have, is we have great people that might own a hotel but live outside of city limits. Why would we want to prevent them and the value that they might bring to the board?
No, but I totally agree. I think there are other boards that that should allow that as well. I think the opportunity of people who work here and spend, you know, buy their groceries and buy the, you know, as part of it, they're as much a taxpayer of the city as take back almost the same part of my statement. So I'm interested in discussing that a little bit more, and I think that's something that us as a group, as a council, take a look at. It's not a deal breaker maybe on this one, but I think, do we allow other people who aren't citizens or don't have residency into some of the other advisory things that take upon the services of the city? I think about the medical community a lot, that there are people that are here traveling through, but they're here for a long term to serve, but they're not a resident. The other is in the wording for the late penalty. Is there an ability to appeal the late penalty or waive the late penalty? A lot of times, you know, there's ownership changes and different things that, at least to give some due process rights to people to say, hey, look, we didn't know about it, we're a new ownership group, or we did, whatever the opportunity is there the ability to also waive that penalty?
In practicality, we have been in certain extent, you know, if we know that there was an ownership change, or it really gets down to your repeat offenders that are constantly late every month. And the other thing we have to be careful of is that people understand this is a tax, it's not income for your business. So you are, you know, taking it on behalf of the customer and transferring it over, just like you take money out from an employee's paycheck for FICA and you transmit it to the federal government. You can't use that for your own cash flow. And I think when things get tough, people tend to look at those areas. We've been very fortunate to the extent that we really haven't had a major issue. We did about 3 years ago, when I was early on, we had one that got very, very behind, and there was a change of ownership, but the previous owner eventually made good on it. Took some time. You just work it out with them, and you work on a repayment plan, and you get them back in place, and honestly be able to get those funds over to the CVB. As far as the appeals process, I'll have to talk to the attorney's office on that, because it does change. I think it changed it from like one type of penalty to an administrative one, so we have a little bit more control over it. But I'll have an answer for that from the city attorney's office when we come back with that. I would add just one more thing onto Councilor Neitzert's question too, in terms of, you asked about new hotels being planned and so forth. The one thing I would say, having coming from the banking sector, as well as just discussions with individuals out there, is that even when there's interest in development of a new hotel, I think the capital credit for hotels right now is still very tight. And you try to purport how strong Sioux Falls is in terms of its numbers overall, and that we're back to where we were. But the challenge you have when you're in the banking sector is that you have regulators coming in, and they will look at they always have something that really is on their list of things that they're worried about. You know, sometimes it's agriculture, and so then they're really hammering on the ag loans when they're coming in to do their audits and regulations, and, you know, being really strong about whether they should be classified loans or not. And I think hospitality is probably one of those areas that they're looking at, just because of the impact that it had nationally during the pandemic. And so even when the demand is driving that, sometimes the capital takes a little bit of time to catch up, or those deals just become a little bit harder to put together, or they're coming in at rates that just aren't reasonable, given the structure, so.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, I just have one about 40 rooms or less does not have to pay. Could you give me some context on, like, how many hotels do we have that are less than 40 and why there's a limit, why they don't have to pay that tax?
I think that the 40 is set in state law, but I'm not quite sure. But you have a better idea of the numbers of those hotels.
We have about 6 hotels who fall into that 40 and below. And that was determined back when the ordinance was being put together, that probably those hotels are more of the real transient guest, perhaps, and it was just a guideline that the board at that time decided to go with.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I make
Yes,
one
the
point, please?
floor is yours.
I just want to acknowledge that all these folks out here, about 99.9% of these people here are our voting members on our current advisory council and bid board, and of course the staff. So this is a very important issue and topic and progress for our industry, and so they're all here out of sincere interest and hope that we can move this forward and continue to grow the industry. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you that attended for this presentation. Just because there wasn't a lot of questions doesn't mean that this council doesn't really take this very serious, because we've all done a lot of homework on this. That's why we limited our questions. So thank you very much. Move on to our next very exciting presentation, Medical Cannabis Regulations Update. Please feel free to stick around for this exciting presentation, or you can leave.
Jamie, it's on the desktop.
What's that? You don't come with your own rubies? No, and I noted a hint of sarcasm in that. Exciting comment. It's exciting for us, isn't it, Jamie? Yes, okay, all right. Good afternoon, Council. Stacy Koistra, City Attorney. What a pleasure to be appearing in front of you on this side of the dais. I had a finance joke queued up, but then he had a whole posse, so I guess I'm not going to be able to use that one. With that, yeah. All right, well, I'm pleased to be providing you an update, a couple main topics for medical cannabis for the city of Sioux Falls this afternoon. And what I'm going to start with, particularly for the benefit of our new council members, is kind of just some background on the timeline to orient this, because there was a lot obviously going on in 2021 and 2022, and just to help kind of give us all the same baseline for where we are as we look to move forward. And so it was actually in 2020, in November, when Initiated Measure 26 was adopted by the voters of the state of South Dakota. That initiated measure ultimately became law on July 1 of 2021 as South Dakota Codified Law 34-20G, medical cannabis. Later that year, in August, we had the first reading in front of this body for our city ordinances that implemented that statutory scheme. As I think you are all aware, there was a simultaneous effort on the part of the state to be drafting their Department of Health regulations to determine what exactly the implementation of those statutes look like. Certainly a dynamic time from a legal point of view and policy point of view. September 7th was the second reading here where our ordinances were adopted and those remain in effect today. Those ordinances went into effect on October 1st, and then the state regulations became effective on October 4th. And then it was at this last legislative session where our state legislature adopted amendments to 234-20G, and so today I'm here to brief you up on those. and to discuss with you the proposed ordinance revisions that we are making to align city ordinance with those new state laws. Second reading, subject to your approval this evening, would occur next week, Tuesday, regarding our city ordinances, and then the state statutes will become effective here on July 1st. In the continued vein of factual background, so the state of South Dakota, statewide, we have 67 dispensaries that have received registration from the Department of Health. There are 25 cultivation facilities that have received approval, 10 cannabis manufacturers, and one testing facility. What this does is it provides just a brief overview of the 4 types of establishments that were passed by law that can exist. Dispensaries, which is the retail face of medical cannabis distribution. Cultivation, of course, would be the growing component of that. Manufacturers, which would take the leaves, the plants, and convert them into whatever products they would be sold. And then there's a state law requirement that those be tested. And so there's only one of those at this point that's been approved, not necessarily even in existence. City of Sioux Falls, we have 5 dispensaries. For some reason that slid north. I don't know. It didn't look like that when we loaded it. But so these are the names of the 5 dispensaries, the 5 lottery selectees, as it were, that when we held that lottery, and then the city council also approved the existence of testing facilities in the city, and there are not any of those. So those are the 5 that we'll be discussing somewhat in more detail as we move forward. This is a brief overview of the Senate bills that were passed by the legislature, signed into law by the governor, that impact our city ordinances. And I'm just going to run through each of these briefly, but also just kind of align the state law to what we're proposing. This being example number 1. So Senate Bill 24, and these are in the order that you'll see them in our proposed ordinances, not in the chronological order of the Senate bills. And so this city ordinance that is part of our body of ordinances today is again aligning with state law. State law now transitioned, as you can see in 121.001C AC at the bottom there, that originally they had, in the original IM26, it had approved 3 cannabis plants. The legislature adjusted that to 2 flowering plants and 2 non-flowering cannabis plants. We are adding a definition for flowering cannabis plant, just in the interest of clarity. That is the definition there. By the way, I realize these are eye charts and that it's hard to avoid being quite wordy in the realm of the law, so I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. So we are basically this 2 flowering plants, 2 non-flowering plants is what's being proposed, not through anything that's been ginned up either in the city attorney's office or with the administration, but again, it's just to align with state law. Senate Bill 23. And speaking of eye charts, here's one that amends, and I left out the old language because it's just too much content, but this basically defines the practitioner-patient relationship. My belief is that the legislature intended to just provide additional detail and specifics to ensure that those are in fact valid practitioner-patient relationships. And so that's kind of your summary. It expands in detail to require, for example, in subparagraph A there, that there be in-person physical examinations, and that the care, as in subparagraph D, would be one for debilitating medical conditions and not solely for the purpose of receiving cannabis as an authorized use. Senate Bill 19. Is one that, in effect, broadens the list of facilities in which a designated caregiver can assist more than 5 qualifying patients. So you can have, per IM26, a designated caregiver, but that's capped at 5 people that a caregiver can assist, with the exception now that you have additional facilities in which they can actually serve more than 5. And it does strike the residential care facility, and I believe it's just an intent to be more specific on the part of the legislature. Senate Bill 26 basically broadened the definition of a practitioner from just a physician to a couple different options there, which would be physician assistant or registered nurse, advanced practice, registered nurse. And again, these are all city ordinance changes that are basically languages taken right from state statute. So Senate Bill 4 is basically the written certification component. As you may recall, you do not, physicians do not prescribe medical cannabis. They just certify that there is a condition that exists, and under the old language, statutorily, the physician, or now the broadened practitioner definition, would have had to state that the patient is likely to receive a benefit, a therapeutic or palliative benefit from that, whereas now that language has been stricken, and basically the practitioner is just certifying that the person has the underlying condition as defined by state law. Senate Bill 10, basically, in a nutshell, they added the requirement that before someone can enter a dispensary, that they have to have a photo ID. Before it was just that they had to verify their identity, and now that's done by identification. And lastly, another eye chart, but this actually has just 3 basic changes to it. The first is that if you can see in paragraph A3 above there, that smoking was prohibited as a form of medical cannabis consumption on public transportation. The legislature broadened that to include vaping, as well as under the age of 21. The second change there relates to testing facilities, and actually this is a proposed city change, which we had some advertising limitations in paragraph D there, and since the council approved and broadened it to include testing facilities, again, we don't have any, but we would just apply those advertising requirements to testing facilities as well as dispensaries themselves. And lastly, we just broadened the language that went from use for employers. It basically allows possession, transfer, display, or transportation in the workplace to be prohibited by employers. And so with that, I'll take any questions on this. If you could read that, that would say there's an update for city licensees statuses that our esteemed chair, Councilor Sale.
Well, I will go on the record to say that what you presented us in the hard copy is correct without all of the over printing. So somebody got that right. I appreciate that.
I'm no conspiracy theorist, but I believe it may come out of the clerk's office.
This we have in our hand came out of the clerk's office. We know that. Councilors, let's ask questions on this part. There are none. Please move. Oh, Councilor Starr.
Sorry. First of all, in the 5 DBAs that you listed that have city license or
Yes.
received the city licenses, will they do a DBA then because their LLC name doesn't necessarily fit our advertising guidelines, or how do we help them get so that they're following the rules we put in place?
Yep, the one, so you can see Canacare up there, and again, that's of course the one that's covered by the title, but so PJS Holdings LLC was the actual entity that received the license, but they are DBAing themselves, holding themselves out, doing business as Canacare. And we saw that on actually the state registration website is where we noted that, so.
Okay. The other one, when, of course, you got to flip through everything again, is to go back to the IDs. I should have done this backwards, but so the only way that someone can qualify for the program is to have a photo ID issued by the state?
Well, this ID component is just to get into a dispensary. And so, as far as the card holder, this is distinct from the card holder and the access. This is just, if you have a dispensary, not unlike probably somebody getting into a bar, they're gonna be carded as opposed to just, it was left unspecified how that verification would occur. And I think the legislature just noted that and said, hey, let's require them to have an ID going in the door.
Yeah, I'm trying to visualize a nursing home patient that would do it, that's been in a nursing home. I know when my mom was in the nursing home for a few months, her driver's license expired, and then but I couldn't see her going to a retail shop that maybe a caregiver is bringing it or transporting it as part of that. So
I believe, and Keith and Jamie can correct me if I'm wrong, but caregivers are able to go to the dispensary and pick it up for those they're caring for, so that would alleviate the need for a homebound or someone in a nursing home to actually physically go to the dispensary themselves.
So is the dispensary required to keep a list of who entered the facility, or is it just a matter of using the ID to enter?
I'm not sure. I mean, we'd maybe have to look into that one to check. I don't know if they have to keep a list of everyone that they allow access. You know, somebody's going to have to be a card holder to get into the dispensary, so there's going to be a roster in that respect, which would be the state's roster, actually. And so, but as far as whether on the back end, then they have to make a list of who actually entered, that I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Well, no, I was going to make a joke about Sudafed, but I decided to drop that as part of it as well. But it just, you know, because if you do require a list, then who gets access to the list? And so then you go down a direction. So if I was with someone who had a card, so I couldn't enter the facility?
Correct.
So it's
That's my
only that-
understanding. Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm just trying to figure out exactly how the practice, so that we can explain it to someone who's, at some point will ask, so.
Unless you're a caregiver.
How do I document that I'm a caregiver? I drove them there that day?
You'd have to be in a, well, as far as.
Do I get a card as a caregiver? Or register as a caregiver? Thank you.
Anything else on this section? All right, please move forward.
All right, so here's the status of the 5, so to speak, that have been approved. Before I get into that, I'll just remind you procedurally there are 3 things that must occur before a cannabis dispensary can become operational. The first is that they need the City of Sioux Falls license. That license can and they have been issued, but they are contingent upon these subsequent requirements, which includes registration from the Department of Health, from the state, and then they would also need ultimately a certificate of occupancy before they could begin conducting business in city limits. Now I want to touch a little bit on the location. Again, a bit of an orientation component to this. So here's a map of the city of Sioux Falls. You can see I-29 and 229 carve off there. And the green dots are actually, and we used this map in the past when we went through our other briefings and updates, but I added these arrows just to make it a little more user friendly. And I'm gonna show you a quick some photos and maps of where each of these are, but you can see in this slide where they're spread out throughout the city. So Canacare, the one we referenced, the DBA at PJS Holdings, the map on the left, you can see that's 41st Street and Carolyn Avenue, so that's just off of I-29 and 41st Street, and that's a photo. Basically the building that's facing us, it would be on the right-hand side there where the dispensary itself would go. Deja Vu, this is the one up on the north side. You can see Russell Street there, just on the bottom part of that photo, and it's basically in a warehouse area. And obviously at the time this photo was taken, they were not in the process of transitioning yet into a dispensary, but that's the address on their application. East River Farms, the photo on the left just shows this is at the corner of 69th and Louise. Basically, it's still a blank lot, an empty lot on that Google Earth photo, but on the right, you're probably familiar with that signage. It would go right into that strip mall right there. The flower shop is over on 49th and Western, as you can see on the map there on the left, and then the strip mall itself photo, you can see many people are familiar, the Air Force recruiting office is right there. They would be on the right-hand side in that strip mall.
Sorry, most people don't know that there's an Air Force recruiting
Oh.
office there.
That may be related to my second job, but,
By Runnings.
what's that?
It's by Runnings, across the street.
By
from
Runnings, there you go, former Campbell Supply.
You're correct.
Genesis Farm, so this is the fifth one. This too is an empty lot, this remains an empty lot. That's Minnesota Avenue, South Minnesota Avenue, and there's Sioux Sports, it's immediately south of that. And so the status, back to the three requirements. City licenses have been issued, the contingent city licenses for all 5 entities, establishments, and state registration has also been granted to all 5. That was in January of this year. Yet this is where we remain. So that we have not granted any certificates of occupancy, nor have we received any applications. Which leads to a few other just parting points. This is my last slide. This is a question that we commonly get. I think Jamie can vouch for that, which is when are we going to have a cannabis dispensary operational in the city of Sioux Falls? The long and short of that is we can't answer that. The city does not really play a role in that unless and until we get an application for that certificate of occupancy. You know, this is an area, as we all know, it's an industry that's standing up in South Dakota, and when you get into cultivation and manufacturing and testing, let alone the brick and mortar components of this, you know, these are the things that the 5 and many other entities throughout the state are wrestling with, including, of course, supply chain. So this is another thing I wanted to point out. So these licenses are transferable. And so having mentioned the location of all of those, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they do end up transferring to other locations within the city. They still, of course, and I'm not going to read this is the city ordinance, these sub-bullets, and I won't read that, but the long and short of it is that they would still have to pass all the location requirements, all the zoning criteria, all of that the original licensees had to follow. And lastly, renewal. And so December 31, 2022, they need to renew their licenses prior to that time. That's an annual fee of $25,000. And with that, I will take your questions, if any.
Councilors, questions? Councilor Neitzer.
No questions, just comments. The first is, I won't name the entity, but one of the 5 is in the process of working on transferring to another location. I don't know if they've actually submitted it, but they've confirmed for me they're submitting a conditional use application. They would still have to meet the same requirements, same distance requirements, so they have to find another eligible location, but they just wanted to potentially just find another location because they, and I think some of the others, felt like there was maybe a little too much in one area, and they just wanted to have it more spread out just for marketing purposes. And then the other thing is, as the city attorney had referenced, obviously it's hard to know when the first one is going to open because you need a product to sell, and it's really the supply chain. They need the manufacturing, they need the actual cultivation, and that takes a while to come online and then for that to start growing. So they're really kind of waiting for the supply before they can obviously open their doors. So we continue to wait. So thanks.
Councilor Starr.
The renewal process, is that going to be similar to the alcohol process? Will that come before the council, or will that just be an application and a renewal? I forgot how we set that up.
It's just a renewal. Or does it come before the council? No.
But if, let's say like an alcohol license, there's violations, or is there any?
Jamie Palmer with licensing. With the renewal process, they would be required to submit their whole application again and pay their fee and submit it to me. There is no requirement that it has to come before council at this time, and I don't know that we have any language in there as far as violations.
Okay, so we couldn't not renew? Or what gives us the ability to not renew someone if they were for whatever reason, being a bad actor or selling to people they're not supposed to, or is that all a state process then?
Yeah, there isn't any current language in our ordinance. I'm guessing there's probably something in state, but I can certainly check into that and get back to you on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And then maybe for Stacy, the other one was I was looking at the location for Canacare, the first one,
Yes.
with our diverging diamond that we're so proud of that we're putting into place along 41st Street. That building's gonna be, I know the Pizza Hut building, that one is gone, the first one in the picture with the overhead, but I mean, obviously there's gotta be enough right away or the building wouldn't stay, but the way that comes through there and that street being blocked off, does that, again, not our decision from a building or location, but the traffic count's huge, but you can't get there.
Yeah, I think that's more of a strategic concern probably for PJS Holdings, but from our point of view, I don't know, and I'm not the one to ask, I don't know how much that would impact that property or its value or its traffic counts. But from our point of view, you know, unless and until it transfers, that's the place it'd be required to be.
The on-ramp will be really close to them. Let's put it that way from my remembrance of the schematics as part of that. So, thank you.
Other council members? Councilor Cole?
To my knowledge, there is no tax advantage. In fact, and I don't want to speak out of school because I'm not a CPA, but my understanding is that they are not entitled to deduct business expenses as part of this. Again, that's at the federal level and IRS, and I'll defer to the experts on that. But it is my understanding that not only do they have all the same requirements, but they have fewer opportunities to deduct from your more traditional businesses.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Neitzer?
I want to say the Department of Revenue also, they made an interpretation that it was subject to general sales tax that has to be remitted because it's not a legally prescribed drug, because there was a question as to whether it be exempt as other drugs are from tax. But I believe this one is ordinary sales tax, so I think we're going to collect 2 pennies, I want to say. Just like a normal, I don't know if you remember, but I'm quite certain that's what the interpretation was. Unless
Yeah.
something changes.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak out of school on that. I'm just not sure. It does speak, however, to the challenges of establishing these businesses and everything that comes with them.
If I could maybe, it is kind of, it's been a while since we looked at this. It is interesting. I remember the state has, you know, quite a bit of process in their administrative rules as it relates to, you know, their inspections and citations and things like that. Although, as I recall, I don't think the law necessarily gives them a lot of latitude or a lot of heavy power, but I'm not sure whether, it would be an interesting thing that we should look at as to whether or not there should be, like, for example, assuming we even have the power, maybe we're preempted from it, but it's our license, I would think we could potentially, if we can give it, we can potentially take it away. Would there be something, for example, if in the ensuing year there had been some sort of action from the Department of Health or some sort of violation, that at the very least it would come to us or something, or some sort of, or a trigger mechanism at the very least where potentially the administration could invoke a revocation proceeding or something. Now, I don't know if we're preempted, but that might be worth looking at, so.
I suspect we're not preempted because it is our license, to your point, but we'd want to look at that criteria and the requirements, but I trust there's some discretion there and it's not an automatic renewal, but
Yeah.
it's worthy of a look.
But that being said, for the most part, as I recall, virtually most of the authority in terms of inspections and all that was really vested to the state. I mean, they were really the ones that are supposed to be going in and inspecting and doing that sort of stuff. I don't know whether or not we've established if we can do stings or anything like that. Maybe that still has to be established. So obviously, if the state does something that revokes, obviously they would be out of compliance with our license, and I would presume that would mean that our license would be then invalid or something. But it might be worth revisiting that. I think Councilor Starr at least brings up a interesting point.
Yeah, I know, I agree. And the other, you know, some things are going to remain in our domain from fire and local health codes and that sort of thing.
Other questions, comments, counselors? Uh-oh. Do you have something for us?
Okay, it's not, in reference to your question again, it's not embedded within the renewal of the license itself, but there are violations and grounds for revocation and suspension, so it would go into that process. There are several items listed that would cause that. And in that section, it does talk about that a letter would be given to the license holder notifying them that they're being considered for suspension and revocation. Then I would report the findings to the city council, and you would make a public hearing, or you would have a public hearing to make final determination of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other comments, I'd like to again appreciate all the hard work the city attorney's office has done on this subject and look forward to collecting the revenue. This time we have public comment. Before I go to Councilor Jensen, I would just like to point out, if you're watching at home, you still have time to go vote. If you're watching a rerun, you've probably missed the voting period. Councilor Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a motion to enter into executive session for the purpose of consulting with legal counsel or reviewing communications from legal counsel about proposed or pending litigation or contractual matters pursuant to South Dakota Codified Law 1-2523.
For a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Let's go have a roll call vote, please.
Council members Barranco,
Yes.
Cole, Jensen,
Yes?
McCoris,
Yes.
Nitzert,
Yes.
Selberg, Sale,
Yes.
Starr.
That motion is passed. Thank you very much. With this time, we'll clear the chambers and go to executive session.